Hey everyone, Mr. Foster here. So we are in week 5, and in order to stay on track to where we can get our first exam out of the way, we need to look at what I like to call, at least for the purposes of this class, pre-Shakespeare poetry. Now, obviously, that's like a really, really broad category, but when we talk about English literature or sorry, literature that is written in the English language at the very least. We basically have before and after Shakespeare. He is kind of like the dividing mark that we use to say, okay, now we have who we consider to be the greatest writer in the English language who has come and gone. So we kind of set our timeline to like what did writing look like before Shakespeare and what does it look like after he, did his thing. Okay. So that is why in this very broad uh, array of poetry we're looking at this week, I just call it pre-Shakespeare poetry because we have, ancient poems, things like the Wife's Lament and the Western Wind that are like thousands of years old. And then we have all the way up to stuff like Sir Walter Raleigh and Christopher Marlowe, who were, just around the same time, if not a little bit earlier than Shakespeare. So basically, these are all poems, obviously written before Shakespeare really hit the scene, but we just need to look at them in. I don't want to say that this poetry is necessarily simplistic, because there is still a lot going on within these poems, but in comparison to what Shakespeare would go on to do, these poems are more, I guess I could say, rudimentary in a certain way. So really, we're kind of taking a light week this week. Hopefully, this won't be too much work for you. I want you to read the poems, obviously. I know it looks like a lot, but the poems usually, they're pretty short. Like Western Wind is only like 4 lines long or something like that. So we can read poems faster. We can read, several poems within a week. And after you read over the poems, what I want your written response to be, and you'll turn this into the Dropbox, is it should be pretty straightforward. You don't have to use an article or read an article or anything. I do have an article posted if you would like to look at it, because some of you might read the Western Wind poem and just be like, huh, that's it. So I do have an article about Western Wind that you can look at. But you are not required to use any articles this week. I just want you to focus on the poems themselves. But what I want you to give me in your written response is just talk about how do these poems deal with human emotions? How do they deal with sadness? How do they deal with longing? How do they deal with love and lost love and unrequited love? That kind of stuff. Okay. I do want you to be pulling examples out from the poems to support your answer. So, if you're writing about On Monsieur's Departure, and, that's by Queen Elizabeth I, and you can say, this is how the speaker is dealing with this in this poem, then show me the line of the poem that you're talking about and use that as a piece of evidence to support what it is you're saying, okay? So this week hopefully shouldn't be too bad, and I say that because next week will be a little bit more heavy than this week is, because we have to do a play and some Shakespeare poetry. But after we get this week and next week out of the way, then we will be on track to do our first exam. So as you're doing these responses this week, also be thinking about how can you give yourself something to say if you are going to be answering a question about these poems in the first exam. Okay. So that's the main thing we're trying to work on this week is if I ask you a question about this set of poetry that we're looking at this week on the first exam, would you be able to have enough to go on to answer the question? Okay. So that's really what we're trying to do this week. So read over these poems, give me your written response, and hopefully this will help you when we have to take the first exam. And then next week we will look at Shakespeare, and then we will be ready to take exam one, the early stuff, Sophocles through Shakespeare. Okay? So do this for this week. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next update.